Hello everyone! In this video we are going to be talking about the Tale of Genji. Again, you'll probably want some note-taking materials. If you just came from the Heian Literature background video, then just keep that Google Doc open, keep that notebook open, and we're going to get started right away. So before we get started talking about the Tale of Genji itself, we need to talk about the genre of the novel. So there are really kind of four questions that we ask ourselves when we want to determine if something is a novel or not. Because if I say, think about a novel, you're gonna, pick up your copy of The Road, or As I Lay Dying, or Infinite Jest, or, Pride and Prejudice, or any number of, books, right? When we think of a novel, we all know what that looks like in our heads in the year of our Lord 2020. But if I asked you to define the novel in one sentence, if I asked you, what does it take for something to be a novel? It would be really hard to define a novel without saying, well, it's not poetry, it's not a short story, it's not nonfiction, it's not this, that, or the other. So it can be tough to define what a novel is because it did emerge so organically over time. But we can ask ourselves four questions to determine whether or not something is, by genre, a novel. So the first question, is it fictional? If it's not fictional, it's not a novel. A novel must have at least some level of fictionality. Now you can have like historical fiction, you can have a novel that's based on some true event, but it has to be, or have, like I said, some level of fictionality. The second question to ask yourself, is it prose? Obviously, up until this point, we've been reading a ton of verse in this class, right? We've been reading epic poems, we've been reading short poems, we've been reading, narratives that are in verse, like the Canterbury Tales. We've been reading a lot of fiction that's, in prose, like Augustine's Confessions, but we haven't read that much prose yet. And if it's in verse instead of in prose, then it's not a novel. A novel can have elements of poetry, like where the words sound very poetic or very lyrical, but if it's in verse, it is not a novel. Third, is it meant for intimate or personal reading? Think about things like the Iliad, think about things like Beowulf, even think about, stories like Landval or Lastic, where, especially in Europe, a lot of even medieval literature is meant to be read aloud to someone. The Canterbury Tales were meant to be read aloud to an audience. The Ovid's Metamorphoses were meant to be performed rather than read silently. And then obviously things like Beowulf and the Iliad come straight out of, oral narration, oral storytelling. The concept of the novel, at least in Europe, or in kind of Europe and America, comes to us out of, like I said, I think last week with Chaucer, the rise of the middle class. And with the rise of the middle class comes an increased differentiation between private life and public life. Because if you think about the ancient world, you think about parts of, at least, the medieval world, and you think about how everybody is kind of all living communally, everybody is sort of living in these shared spaces where, everybody kind of knows your business. You might live and work in the same building. And even in Japan during the Heian period, this would have been true for the majority of people, your farmers, your craftspeople, your merchants and whatnot, just not for the aristocracy. And so what we ask ourselves with a novel is this meant for, kind of communal consumption? Is this meant to be spoken aloud or read aloud? Or is it meant for someone to curl up with it next to a window on a rainy day, right? Novels are meant for people to read by themselves to themselves, what we call intimate reading or personal reading. And, with things like audiobooks, obviously you can still have that sort of more performance type of experience with a novel. But the intention for a novel is for one person to read it at a time. And then finally, you can ask yourself, is it usually pretty long? There's no official length for a novel, but we think about if it's less than 100, like 100, 120 pages, we might call it a novella. If it's less than like 30 to 50 pages, we probably call it a short story. Like, again, if you think in your head about what a novel is, it's usually pretty chunky. Like, it's a chunky little book. And so asking yourself these 4 questions, is it fictional? Is it prose? Is it meant for intimate reading? And is it pretty long? Will usually let you know if something is a novel or not. Again, you can use your instincts and they'll usually be right, but coming up with a definition for a novel is important because of the way that we want to talk about novels today. Again, we can contrast novels to epic poems, cultural epics, these frame narrative collections. Now, in European terms, the novel arose in Europe out of things like the Canterbury Tales, where it's telling like a collection of stories. But more importantly, it rose out of collections of short stories, like Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur from the 14th century, where Malory took all of the King Arthur stories that he could get his hands on and just smooshed them all together in one book. There's no real connection between the stories. He doesn't try very hard to draw like one single connecting arc between all of them. He just crams them all together in one book in a generally chronological fashion, but it's not one cohesive story yet. But that's the beginning of the European novel. Now, the first novel that we see in Europe is Don Quixote, written in 1605. That's the first time that we get a single text that answers all 4 of these questions with the word yes. Don Quixote is also considered to be the first novel because the 5th question, or the 5th piece of criteria for a novel, is not one that I mentioned, but it is the concept that novels typically deal more with the interior life or the interior self of the characters than other kinds of texts do. Think about the Canterbury Tales. How much do we see sort of inside the heart and mind of each character? We don't, right? We just sort of see their actions and we have to make a lot of inferences about who they are. Whereas in a novel, you will see a lot of interiority, you'll see a lot of like who the character is on the inside, and a lot more like personal narration. So after Don Quixote, we get the first novelist in English, which is Daniel Defoe, and he wrote things like Robinson Crusoe. He wrote Moll Flanders in the early 1800s. So novels were starting to become popular across the 17th century after Don Quixote was written, and the novels in English really only took off in the 18th century. But once they took off, they took off. So that's the story of European novels. But globally, the first novel was written by our girl, Murasaki Shikibu, because she wrote the Tale of Genji in the 11th century. She wrote her novel 500 years before Don Quixote hit the shelves. So, let's talk about Murasaki Shikibu. She wrote 3 things, and I mentioned this in the last video. She wrote the Tale of Genji, she wrote the Diary of Lady Murasaki, and she wrote some poetry. She lived from either 973 or 978 to 1014 or 1031, depending on which kind of piece of evidence you're working with. So Murasaki was born in Heian-kyo into the Fujiwara clan, so she was already born into great privilege. And she had an older brother, and as a child, they were both educated the same. That is something that we actually see relatively often, especially when we talk about powerful or well-educated women. Often what happens is that, they will have like a brother, a younger or older brother, and then because it's just easier to go ahead and tutor two children at once rather than to try to teach them separately, the girl ends up having the same education as the boy. We see this in other like medieval, Renaissance, ancient kinds of figures, and it was no different for Murasaki. In fact, she was better at Chinese than her brother was. She was better at the language. She was better at picking up on kind of complex ideas than he was. And it's said that her father once remarked that it was a pity that she had not been born a son. But she was she was married at an age that would have been considered older than usual for the time period. She wasn't married until her mid-20s, maybe even later. Some sources indicate maybe even as late as 30, when most of her peers would have been getting married in their late teens or early 20s. She had one daughter, and her husband died when her daughter was about 2 years old, and so he died around the year 1000. She was already known by this time to be a pretty skilled writer. And in fact, because she wrote the Tale of Genji between 1000 and 1008, it may have been her first work on Genji, as well as her poetic efforts, that landed her the job as lady-in-waiting to one of the empresses in 1005. So she was already well known across the aristocracy for being a really, really good writer, a skilled writer, for being just kind of generally having a good reputation as a person. And then she was invited to be a lady-in-waiting. So she retired from the imperial court in 1011, and she went to live at one of the other Fujiwara homes. So she was brought into the imperial court as a lady-in-waiting to concurrent Empress Shoshi. And here we need to back up a little bit. The emperor at the time had his first empress named Tenshi. Sorry, Teishi, not Tenshi. Now, Teishi had been involved in some scandal where she had been briefly exiled from the court in disgrace for supporting the wrong brother in a power grab. But she was still empress, and she had the imperial title of Radiant Heir Bearer or Radiant Child Bearer, which is a heck of an imperial name. So Teishi was initially empress, and then the emperor then raised up another woman from his harem, Shoshi, as a second concurrent empress. So this was completely unprecedented, that there were two empresses at the same time, and he had to find a way to, at least rhetorically, make them equal. And so he named Shoshi Empress Palatine, so that they would have kind of both imperial titles. Now, Shoshi, when she was elevated to empress, was between 16 and 19, so she was quite young. And the emperor wanted to, again, make sure that she was on an equal level with Teishi. And one of the ways that imperial women kind of demonstrated their power and their culture was to hold literary salons, where, all of the literary luminaries would get together and talk about poetry and write poetry and stuff. And so it's highly likely that Murasaki was brought into the imperial household not just to serve as lady-in-waiting or to serve as, her official title was like companion tutor, but that she was really there to help Shoshi develop a salon to rival Teishi's salon. It's also possible that Murasaki was brought to court as an intended rival for, say, Shonagon, who was sort of one of the luminaries of Teishi's own court. So artistic rivalries were common during this time, and they were thought of as a way to spice up boring imperial life, as well as a kind of a quality control measure so that nobody got too cozy being, the best writer at court. So a lot of this we know from Murasaki herself. A lot of this we know from her diary. And so her diary is not just like a daily account. She gets really, really into like her own thoughts and her own impressions of the people around her. For example, Sei Shonagon was known to be very like clever and funny and outgoing, while Murasaki was much more introverted, kind of very withdrawn. And Murasaki thought that Sei Shonagon was actually really conceited and that she was like really really kind of arrogant and pretentious in her writing. And so we see the way that she thought about the other people in the court. She was really quite critical, but she wasn't just critical of other people, she was also critical of herself and her own writing. She was also known to be very serious, very intellectual, very unassuming, very humble. She often criticizes herself in her diary of like not being able to be as frivolous as the other women and sometimes wishing that she could be. And then sometimes she looks at sort of the frivolity around her and she's very harsh towards it. So the common pastimes for women in the imperial court were mostly writing poetry, getting drunk, gossiping, and having affairs, just because there wasn't very much else to do. And we know that Murasaki thought that Shoshi's court was like really dull and really strict. Because Shoshi was so young when she became empress, she tried really, really hard to be like a good girl, basically, for lack of a better term. She was trying to be very conscientious of her duties, and that made her kind of stuffy. And over time, she did relax some, but Murasaki still felt like she was kind of hemmed in by the court that was pretty boring. But she also thought that court life in general, and especially the way that the women around her responded to court life, was petty and shallow, and she thought that there was like too much drama just in general, which is kind of ironic given what the Tale of Genji is mostly about. And we'll see that in just a second here. A couple final notes on Murasaki herself. The name Murasaki Shikibu is a nickname, and perhaps one that is self-given. Her given name may have been Fujiwara no Takako, because she was part of the Fujiwara clan, but we don't know for sure. So we call her Murasaki Shikibu because that's what she called herself. And here we see a couple of images of her. These are both from this 17th century, this is 18th century. This is an image of her on a fan, her at her writing desk, and this is just a nice picture. This is pretty. And here we can actually see this kind of cursive style writing as well. So you can see it's very flowing, it's very kind of casual compared to some of the other forms of writing that we see during this time period. So now, the Tale of Genji. Again, it was written between 1000 and 1008. It may have been started before Murasaki's husband died, or it may also have been started as a way for her to deal with the grief over his death. The story consists of 54 chapters, all of which were probably not written by Murasaki. Honestly, we're just lucky that we have an author for this text. Y'all know, I don't have to tell you that for so many of these texts, we have no idea who wrote them. And it's really refreshing, kind of like it is with the Chaucer case, to have not just an author, but to know so much about what their life was like, and even to know what they were like as a person. Now, with that said, chapters 1 through 41 were almost certainly written by Murasaki, and that is the bulk of the story. Chapters 42 through 54 may have been written by her daughter or by some other author, and the plot of those chapters changes significantly as well. But either way, the story in its present form was finished by the year 1021, and we know this because another lady of the Heian court wrote about how she had read the whole story and that there were more than 50 chapters. So another lady actually comes out and says, hey, I was reading the Tale of Genji. It's super long. It's like more than 50 chapters long. So that's how scholars know that by the year 1021, it had reached its, well, final form. The Tale of Genji is tough to read, especially for modern audiences, even modern Japanese audiences. For one thing, it is written in very formal classical Japanese language, not just in script, but also in, what the actual words say. But there are a number of reasons why translation can also be very tricky. Part of this is that because aristocratic life was so insular, Murasaki wrote specifically about the concerns of the aristocracy. And this was like 5,000 people. And she didn't just write about like events that would have affected this very small group of people. She also used references and specific language that would have been unique to this very small group of people. I mean, the best modern equivalent I can think of is like if you're part of a really small like fandom, or if you're part of like a really specific, Facebook group or a meme page, where there might be a few thousand people who know what you're talking about, but the wider world, the wider audience, is going to have a tough time. So she does reference a lot of these events and cultural signifiers and even value systems that will seem more foreign to a modern reader. Remember, this is 1,000 years old. This is like trying to make sense of everything in Beowulf, right? A lot of the value systems are going to be foreign to us because it's 1,000 years old. Something else that was very common was in literature of this time period, you rarely gave your characters names. You mostly gave them titles. This was because it was considered straight up rude to use someone's name, right? People at the imperial court referred to each other by their titles, or often if you were a woman, you would be referred to by like the color of your clothing. And so because of this, in the Tale of Genji, there's a lot of shifting names across chapters, and it's hard to track who is who. So you can have a character who in one chapter is referred to as, the yellow lady, but maybe she changes her clothes and the next chapter she's the floral pattern lady. Or if a male character changes like positions between chapters, in one he has this job, in another he has this other job, and it's hard to figure out who is who. The last reason why it can be tough to both translate and to read Genji is that it was common for poetry, and especially idiomatic poetry, to be used in casual conversations, but often they would just abbreviate the poetry and assume that the person they were speaking to, or assume that their reader would be familiar enough with the poem to understand what was going on. Now, we do this with modern idioms. We say things like "when in Rome" without finishing the idiom, because we all understand that the rest of it is "when in Rome, do as Romans do." But we usually just say these days "when in Rome," and we get that we're expressing the idea that when you are in a foreign or an unfamiliar culture or setting, that you should kind of do what locals do, or you should follow the lead of someone who is familiar with the situation. We know that because it's part of our idiomatic context. But we don't have the right context to understand the idiomatic usage of the poetry in the Tale of Genji. Again, it's kind of like looking at a meme. We know what memes are. If you know what, who Gritty is, the Philadelphia hockey mascot, you know that Gritty memes are a thing, and you know how funny they are. But if you don't know who Gritty is, or if you don't know why he's so funny, then that's not a context that you're able to understand. So all of these things come together to make the Tale of Genji a little bit tough for modern audiences. Not just in terms of, it's 1,000 years old, or it's from a different culture, but even just in the language used. because of the time period and culture differences, obviously. It can be tough, but it's not impossible. Let's talk a little bit more about genre, and the story itself. It is a novel. We've established that. But in terms of genre, like thematic genre, it's we would probably most consider it like a soap opera today, right? It just follows the relentless, like, interpersonal drama of the main character. All of his love affairs, all of his crimes, all of his exiles and his career stuff. It's just one thing after another in the life of this one main character, Hikaru Genji. So the story is really split into 3 parts. His youth, his exile, and his return, with, again, that 4th bit that was added later. It really focuses on the vagaries of aristocratic life, right? And some of these things are realistic, and like a soap opera, some of them are beefed up for the sake of the drama. It's an extremely dramatic work. And dramatic in the sense of, like, interpersonal drama, not dramatic in the sense of, like, a stage play. The story also contains a lot of things that we would be less chill with today. You will remember that it's pretty common even today in aristocracies for close relatives to marry. If you recall how many of, like, Queen Victoria's children and grandchildren intermarried, you'll know that that's not an old, it's still a recent thing, and it's not something that is unique to any one culture. So there's some of that in the book. There are a lot of gender dynamics in the book that we frown upon today. There is also some kind of uncomfortable treatment of sexual assault, and there's one part where Genji just straight up, like, grooms a child to raise her into his ideal woman and then marries her. So there's some stuff here that we're not chill with today. But again, at the time, in a different historical context, these things were considered ethical and normal. And beyond any kind of ethical concerns that we may have, it is a hugely important text. It is read constantly in Japanese schools, kind of in the way that we might read, I don't know, Shakespeare, Charles Dickens, somebody like that. The Tale of Genji is always read in Japanese schools. And Murasaki is also commemorated on the 2,000 yen note, which I've included a picture of here. So you can see this is a scene from the Tale of Genji. The Tale of Genji is not just beloved today in Japan. It was almost immediately beloved as a classic. It was consistently copied. Like, from the time that Murasaki, or, whoever finished it, it was consistently copied, and then later printed and reprinted and reprinted. This image here is actually a 12th century image, so from the 1100s, that shows a scene from the story. So right away, people were making art of this story. They were making beautiful copies of it. There's this really, really beautiful extant piece of a text called the Genji Monogatari Emaki that would have been the entire text, but beautifully illustrated, beautifully calligraphed. Unfortunately, we only have 1 or 2 leaves of it left, but if you look it up, it is stunningly beautiful. And it was made maybe 100 years after the book was written, because people loved it right away. It was an instant classic. It's had kind of a dicey translation history. It was first translated into modern Japanese by the feminist writer Yosono Akiko in the early 20th century, but it was first translated into English before that in 1882. And this was a partial translation, and it was awful. It was terrible. It was really, really bad. And now we have what we consider the authoritative English translation, was done in 2001 by Royale Tyler. Now, this translation maintains this pattern of giving the characters titles instead of names, which makes it harder for people like you and me who are kind of maybe more casual consumers of the literature. But it also makes it more conceptually faithful. We've talked a lot about what translation means in this class, and so this is always the line that translators must walk, right? Do I keep the translation more strict and more faithful, or do I come up with a translation that is more easy to read, more accessible, that is going to reach a wider audience? There's always that tension, especially in these older works. Now, finally, I just want to go over with you a character list that will also give us a chance to talk briefly about the overall plot of the story. So, here's our list. First is our hero, Hikaru Genji. Now, about halfway through the story, he is exiled for naughtiness, for an affair. And so during his exile, he goes by Minamoto. Now, on this character list, I have given you as many names as I can rather than titles. And that's just because I want you to be able to understand this as much as possible. And so I personally, as a teacher, am valuing ease of understanding over a strict translation. So Genji is the son of Emperor Kiritsubo. And when Genji is quite small, his mother dies, and his father remarries the lady Fujitsubo, and she becomes empress. Now, initially, Genji, loves her like a stepmother, but then later they fall in romantic love. Genji also marries the lady Oi, which actually means blue, so she's known as the Blue Lady. So she is his first wife, and she just kind of is his wife. That's about it. There is also Reise, who is the crown prince. Now, he is Genji and Fujitsubo's son, but because Fujitsubo is the empress, Reise is raised as the crown prince, so he's raised as Kiritsubo's son, because he is the son of Kiritsubo's wife. Now, Murasaki is the niece of Empress Fujitsubo, and later becomes Genji's beloved second wife. And this is where Murasaki Shikibu either took her nickname from or gave her nickname to this character. So this is also the character that Genji meets when she is a child, and he immediately is like, wow, what a girl, I'm gonna raise her to be my ideal woman. Because he thinks that Lady Fujitsubo is his ideal woman, but obviously she's married to his father, and he cannot marry her. So he essentially grooms, or raises, I guess, Murasaki to be his ideal woman, and then he marries her once she's grown up. It's weird. It's very weird. So that's all really the first part of Genji. Now, the second part, Emperor Kiritsubo dies, and Suzaku becomes emperor. Now, Suzaku is Kiritsubo's son, but his mother is not the empress. His mother is Kokiden, who was part of the imperial harem. Now, Suzaku discovers that Genji has been messing around with a different woman in the court, this time one of Suzaku's concubines, Oboro Tsukio. Now, it's this affair that gets Genji exiled. Now, he is exiled, and during his exile, he meets with a character who is called the Akashi Novice, because he lives in Akashi province. Genji has another affair with the Akashi Novice's daughter, with whom he has a daughter. So eventually, Genji is invited back from exile. Genji is invited back from exile because Suzaku is having weird dreams about his father, and Kokiden becomes ill, so she starts to lose power at court. So Genji is invited back to court. When he comes back, he marries his third wife, who is called Neo-san, and is known as the third princess. Meanwhile, Suzaku steps down or is no longer emperor, and Raizai becomes emperor because he is supposedly the son of the emperor, even though we know that his real father is Genji. So you can see this is getting soapier and soapier. So Raizai is the emperor now, and because Raizai is the emperor, he elevates Genji to the highest position in the land, because he knows now that Genji is his real father. So now starts the third part of the story. Genji is back at court, he's got another wife, he's got a daughter by a girl out in Akashi province, but he is also personally less happy in his life. His political power is fine, but his personal life has become kind of sad and stale to him. So one of the things that happens during this part of the story is that Kashiwagi, Genji's nephew, Kashiwagi, Genji's nephew, I'm sorry, like I said, my Japanese is terrible. His nephew rapes Genji's wife, the third princess, and she gives birth to Kaoru, who is her son, but is raised as Genji's son, in the same way that Raizai was raised as Kiritsubo's son. So we've got this sort of generational cycle kind of happening here. Around the same time, Murasaki tells Genji that she wants to become a nun, and he tells her no, she can't, and shortly thereafter she dies. And of course this absolutely breaks Genji's heart, because out of all of the women that he's ever had a relationship with in his life, and we know that there have been so many, she was his sort of true love. Now, in the book, this is followed by a chapter it's actually really beautiful, where Genji contemplates kind of the nature of mortality, the meaning of life, and you know, what grief is. And that's followed by a chapter that's called Vanished into the Clouds. And this chapter is left blank by Murasaki, which is, I think, a really beautiful narrative move, right? Like, just vanished into the clouds. There's no writing on the page. It's lovely. But the implication is that Genji has died by leaving this chapter blank, by titling it the way she does. Murasaki is indicating to her reader that he has also passed away. So then, remember those later chapters that were probably not written by Murasaki? Those chapters actually follow the life of Kaoru, the son of the third princess. And it has this same kind of soapy feeling to it, but it's also about sort of this second generation of people, or this new generation of people. It's kind of like season 9 of Scrubs. But Kaoru is sometimes considered like the first anti-hero in literature. We could argue that point. But it's about him, and it's about Genji's daughter. This daughter, the daughter of the Akashi novice's daughter, and she later becomes empress, and it's a whole thing, and it's basically just more of the same. But because it was written later, it's often considered not really to be part of the Tale of Genji. Well, it's considered to be part of the Tale of Genji, but it's not part of Murasaki's Tale of Genji. So, I know this is a really long video, and I'm sorry, but I wanted to really walk y'all through as much of it as I could, because I know it is different from a lot of what we've read up until this point. As you read, I would like for you to pay attention to the specific language that Murasaki uses, and also the way that she deals with the sense of interiority. How do we know who these characters are on like a deep, like psychological level? How do we know what their interior selves is like? And how does that contrast to some of the other literature that we've read, right? What other, how does she treat kind of her characters' inner lives in ways that maybe we haven't seen yet? So, until then, happy reading.